The cold, sterile light of dawn had not yet broken through the Washington, D.C. haze, but inside the fourth-floor suite of the Jefferson Hotel, the day had been in full swing for hours. An array of legal pads, highlighted case law binders, and half-empty coffee cups formed a chaotic perimeter around Pam Bondi. She stood before a large window, not looking at the nascent city below, but at her own reflection, her lips moving silently. She wasn't practicing a speech. She was tracing a logical path, a labyrinth of jurisprudence she had constructed over sleepless weeks, a maze from which she believed there was only one exit. Her young associate, a brilliant but perpetually anxious man named David Chen, sat at the large mahogany table, his finger tracing a line in a dog-eared copy of a landmark Supreme Court opinion. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervous energy. The transition from the precedent set in Wickard v. Filburn to the limitations defined in Lopez is the critical juncture, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening. If you can make them see that the federal statute in our case is a bridge too far, a step beyond even the most expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause, then the entire opposing argument weakens. Pam turned from the window, a small, confident smile touching her lips. It wasn't the smile of someone who was merely hopeful. It was the smile of an architect who knew every single stress point and load-bearing wall of her creation. It's not about weakening their argument, David. It's about making it irrelevant. We're not just arguing the facts of this case. We're arguing the fundamental structure of the law. Today, we're going to ask the court to look at the blueprints of the Republic. She walked over to the table and placed a hand on a thick binder labeled The People of Florida, et al. v. the United States. The case was, on its surface, about a new federal data privacy law that a coalition of states, led by Florida, argued was a massive federal overreach into state-level consumer protection, an area traditionally left to them. The federal government countered that in an age of borderless digital commerce, only a uniform federal standard could adequately protect citizens. But beneath that, it was a battle of philosophies, a deep and resonant conflict over the very meaning of federalism. Pam picked up a clean legal pad. On it, she drew a simple diagram, a large circle labeled federal power, and inside it, a smaller, shaded circle labeled enumerated powers. Outside the large circle, she drew another, distinct circle labeled state sovereignty. Their argument, she said, tapping the large circle, is that the digital world has erased the boundaries. They believe the internet makes everything and everyone part of a single, national market, and therefore, everything falls under their purview. Our argument, she drew a firm, clear line from the enumerated powers circle to the federal power circle, and then another equally firm line separating it from state sovereignty, is that the principles of the Constitution were designed to be timeless. The medium changes from horse-drawn carriages to fiber-optic cables, but the principle of limited, delegated power does not. We are not just protecting Florida's right to regulate businesses within its borders. We are defending this line. She tapped the line between the two main circles with her pen. This line is the entire ballgame. David nodded, the knot of anxiety in his stomach loosening just a fraction. He had seen her prepare for major cases before, but this was different. There was a clarity, an almost serene focus about her that was both calming and intimidating. She wasn't just armed with facts. She was armed with a foundational, almost philosophical, certainty. Across the city, in the hushed, book-lined chambers of the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, was adjusting his judicial robe. The black wool felt heavier today. He stood before a portrait of John Marshall, the great Chief Justice who had carved the court's authority out of the raw marble of a new nation. Roberts often looked at that portrait, drawing from it a sense of continuity, of institutional endurance. His role, as he saw it, was not just to interpret the law, but to protect the court itself. He was a steward, a guardian of its legitimacy in an increasingly polarized world. He valued consensus, clarity, and narrow, incremental rulings that prevented the court from being perceived as a political instrument. A sweeping, 5-4 decision in a case like this, one that could redefine the balance of power between the states and Washington, was his worst-case scenario. It would be seen not as law, but as a partisan victory for one side or the other. His law clerk, a young woman named Sarah Eisenberg, who was top of her class at Yale, knocked softly and entered. "The 10-minute bell has sounded, Mr. Chief Justice," she said. He turned from the portrait. "What's the final buzz from the clerk's pool, Sarah?" he asked, his voice even. He valued the informal chatter of the clerks. It was often a surprisingly accurate barometer of the legal zeitgeist. Sarah hesitated for a moment. "There's a lot of talk about Ms. Bondi's brief, sir. It's different. Less of a direct assault on the federal statute's merits and more of a structural critique of the government's entire legal theory. Some are calling it audacious, others a masterstroke. It seems designed to force a conversation about first principles." Roberts nodded slowly. "First principles are a treacherous sea, Sarah. They are where ideologues go to battle. The court is supposed to be a safe harbor, grounded in precedent and text." He smoothed the front of his robe. "An audacious argument invites an audacious ruling, and audacious rulings are what create the storms we are meant to avoid." He walked toward the door that led to the corridor behind the courtroom. He felt the weight of the institution on his shoulders, the immense pressure to find a path through the coming intellectual storm, a path that was sound, principled, and most importantly, narrow. He wanted to solve the case, not rewrite the Constitution. The great chamber of the Supreme Court was a cathedral of law. The soaring ceiling, the marble columns, the heavy velvet curtains, it was all designed to inspire awe, to convey a sense of permanence and gravitas. The pews were filled with a quiet, expectant crowd of lawyers, journalists, and members of the public who had waited in line since before dawn. In the press section, veteran legal correspondent Nina Totenberg sharpened her pencil, her expression one of intense focus. She had covered the court for decades and could sense the atmosphere of a landmark case. There was a charge in the air, a feeling that this wasn't just another oral argument. At precisely 10 a.m., a buzzer sounded, and the marshal of the court struck his gavel. The Honorable, the Chief Justice, and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, oyez, 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 all persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court. The 9 justices emerged from behind the curtain and took their seats at the long mahogany bench. Chief Justice Roberts sat in the center, his face a mask of judicial neutrality. To his right and left, the associate justices settled in, their expressions ranging from the keen interest of Justice Elena Kagan to the stoic impassivity of Justice Clarence Thomas. Roberts surveyed the room and then looked down at the counsel. "Tables, we will hear argument first this morning in Case 23-145, the people of Florida, et al. Versus the United States." Pam Bondi rose from her chair. She walked to the lectern, her movements measured and deliberate. She arranged her notes, took a sip of water, and looked up at the bench. The 9 faces before her represented the entire spectrum of American legal thought. This was not a jury to be swayed by emotion. It was an assembly of the nation's sharpest legal minds, and each had to be convinced on their own terms. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," she began, her voice clear and steady, filling the cavernous room without any hint of strained for the first 15 minutes. She laid her foundation. She didn't attack the federal government's position directly. Instead, she methodically walked the court through a series of their own landmark decisions. On the Commerce Clause, she started with the broadest interpretations, conceding the federal government's power to regulate channels of interstate commerce, instrumentalities of commerce, and activities with a substantial relation to it. She spoke with respect and academic precision, quoting from opinions written by justices on both the liberal and conservative wings of the court. Justice Kagan leaned forward, intrigued. "Ms. Bondi, are you suggesting that a century of this court's jurisprudence is somehow flawed? Your opponent argues that the digital economy is, by its very nature, interstate commerce in its purest form." Pam inclined her head respectfully. "Not at all, Justice Kagan. I am affirming this court's jurisprudence, and I agree that the digital economy is largely interstate. The question before us today is not whether Congress can regulate interstate commerce. The question is whether the specific act of a consumer, within their own home, making a decision about their personal data privacy under a state-mandated disclosure, constitutes an economic activity that Congress can regulate. We contend that it does not. It is an act of personal autonomy, facilitated by a state, that precedes any potential commercial transaction. She was drawing a new line, a subtle but crucial one. She was distinguishing between the act of commerce and the conditions under which a citizen decides whether to engage in commerce. Justice Stephen Breyer, a pragmatist, chimed in, his tone professorial. But counselor, in a practical sense, aren't these things intertwined? The decision about data is integral to the online transaction. To separate them seems artificial. How can we draw a line that works in the real world? This was the opening Pam had been waiting for. It was the question that bridged her foundation to her central argument. With all due respect, Justice Breyer, this court has drawn such lines before, precisely to protect our federalist structure. In United States v. Lopez, this court found that even in our interconnected world, there are limits. It held that the possession of a firearm in a school zone was not an economic activity that substantially affected interstate commerce. It was a non-economic, criminal act. We argue that a citizen's decision-making process regarding their own privacy is similarly non-economic in nature. It is an exercise of a personal right, a right that the state of Florida has chosen to protect. The federal government is not regulating a transaction. It is regulating the citizen's mind before the transaction. A murmur went through the press section. This was a novel, powerful framing. She was equating data privacy with a fundamental right, placing it outside the realm of mere economics. The Solicitor General, arguing for the United States, would have to counter this, but his entire case was built on the premise that everything digital was economic. Pam saw the Chief Justice shift in his seat. Roberts was an institutionalist, but he was also a believer in limits on federal power. She had his attention. Now, she began to build the walls of her logical box. The government's position, if taken to its logical conclusion, would mean that there is no sphere of individual life, no decision to personal, that Congress cannot regulate, as long as it can posit some tangential connection to the digital world. Could Congress then dictate the terms of service for a family's private social media group? Could it regulate the content of emails between a mother and son? If they happen to discuss a potential online purchase, where does the limiting principle lie? She paused, letting the questions hang in the air. This was a classic rhetorical strategy, but she was using it not for flourish, but to set a trap. Chief Justice Roberts, sensing the dangerous breadth of her questions, intervened. He preferred to steer the conversation back to established legal tests. Ms. Bondi, the limiting principle, as established in our precedents, is the test of whether the regulated activity, in the aggregate, has a substantial effect on interstate commerce. The government argues that millions of individual decisions about data privacy, taken together, do have such an effect. How do you respond to that specific test? This was the moment, the pivot point of the entire argument. He had asked her to engage with the court's own established doctrine. David Chen, sitting at the counsel table, held his breath. This was the door she had told him she would walk through. Pam met the Chief Justice's gaze directly, her expression one of calm, intellectual respect. Mr. Chief Justice, I am grateful for that question, because it brings us to the very heart of the matter. The aggregation principle from Wickard, which allowed Congress to regulate wheat grown for personal consumption, has always been controversial. But even in that case, the court was dealing with a fungible commodity, a product that was undeniably economic. The court reasoned that homegrown wheat could displace wheat that would otherwise be purchased on the open market. She took a deliberate step closer to the lectern, her voice becoming even more measured, more precise. But what is the commodity? Here, what is the fungible economic unit? A person's choice, a person's sense of security. The government is asking you to aggregate not a product, but a series of individual, non-economic decisions. If the court allows the aggregation of non-economic choices to justify federal regulation, then the limiting principle you just mentioned ceases to exist. It would mean that any widespread personal behavior, from what we teach our children about online safety to how we configure our home routers, could be aggregated and deemed to have a substantial effect on commerce. The Commerce Clause would be transformed from a specific enumerated power into a general police power over the entire nation, and this court has explicitly and repeatedly rejected that interpretation. Silence. It was a profound, heavy silence. She had taken the Chief Justice's own question, applied the court's own precedent, and shown him that following it to its logical conclusion in this new context would shatter a fundamental tenet of constitutional law. She had not been disrespectful. She had not been partisan. She had used his own tools to show him the flaw in the machine. Justice Samuel Alito broke the quiet, his voice sharp. So, you are asking us to create a new category? A carve-out for digital personal decisions? Pam was ready for this. Not at all, Justice Alito. I am asking the court to apply its existing categories with fidelity. The principle established in Lopez and affirmed in Morrison that Congress cannot regulate non-economic activity based on a but-for causal chain of attenuated effects is the correct and controlling principle here. We are not asking for a new rule. We are asking the court to honor the rule it has already made. She had turned a potential accusation of judicial activism into a plea for judicial consistency. It was a masterful pivot. The red light on the lectern, indicating her time was almost up, was being ignored by the Chief Justice. The debate was too critical. The room was utterly captivated. The usual shuffling of papers and quiet coughs had ceased. Every eye was on Pam Bondi and the Chief Justice. It was clear this was no longer just an argument between a state and the federal government. It was a dialogue between an advocate and the court itself about its own identity. Now, she moved to the final stage of her plan. She turned her focus fully back to the Chief Justice, not with aggression, but with the tone of a fellow lawyer grappling with a difficult problem. Mr. Chief Justice, the court is faced with a difficult choice, one created by the government's theory. If the court accepts their argument, it must either explicitly overturn the non-economic activity distinction from Lopez, which would be a monumental shift in constitutional law, or it must find a way to distinguish data privacy decisions from all other non-economic activities, a distinction that I believe is intellectually unsustainable and would lead to endless future litigation. She paused, letting the two horns of the dilemma become starkly clear. Alternatively, the court can do what it has always done, apply its principles with care. It can rule that while Congress has broad power over the channels of digital commerce, the specific, antecedent, and non-economic decision of a citizen about their personal privacy, under a duly enacted state law, remains within the sphere of the state's traditional police powers to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. This path requires no new doctrine. It breaks no precedent. It simply affirms that even in the modern age, the lines drawn by the framers still have meaning. She had laid the trap, and now she was offering him the only safe way out, the way that led directly to a victory for her side. The pressure in the room was immense. She had constructed a perfect logical box. One wall was the court's precedent in Lopez. The second wall was the court's precedent in Wickard. The third wall was the practical absurdity of regulating all personal digital decisions. The fourth wall was the court's own stated desire to avoid creating new, complicated legal tests. She had left no room to maneuver. Chief Justice Roberts sat motionless. His face, usually so expressive in its subtle shifts, was a placid lake, but his eyes, behind his glasses, were churning. Sarah Eisenberg, watching from the clerk's section, knew that look. It was the look of a man running through 1,000 possible chess moves at once, and finding every single one of them leads to checkmate. He could try to challenge her on the definition of economic, but she had already anchored it to the court's own prior definitions. He could ask another hypothetical, but she had demonstrated a preternatural ability to turn hypotheticals back on the questioner, using them to further illuminate the flaws in the opposing view. He could try to distinguish the case on its facts, but she had masterfully framed it as a case about principle, making the specific facts almost secondary to the structural implications. Pam Bondi stood at the lectern waiting. She did not fill the silence. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze, her posture one of respectful expectation. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. In the charged atmosphere of a Supreme Court argument, it felt like an eternity. 10 seconds. Journalists were scribbling furiously, not quoting anything, but describing the scene itself. The quiet was the story. David Chen felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He wanted to look down, but he couldn't. He was frozen watching the silent duel unfold. 15 seconds. The other justices remained still, watching the Chief Justice. It was his court, his question. They were waiting for him to lead, but he did not speak. In that silence, every person in the room understood what was happening. He was trapped. Any question he asked would concede a point to her. Any challenge would reveal the weakness of the potential. Counterarguments. To speak was to lose ground. The silence was not a void. It was a statement. It was a tacit acknowledgement of the inescapable force of her argument. It was the sound of a perfectly constructed legal argument hitting its mark with such precision that it left no room for rebuttal. It was the quiet concession of a brilliant legal mind recognizing the intellectual cul-de-sac he had been led into, after what felt like a lifetime, but was probably no more than 20 seconds. Chief Justice Roberts blinked. He cleared his throat, a small, almost imperceptible sound that echoed in the silent chamber. He did not ask another question. He did not challenge her premise. He simply looked down at the Solicitor General, who was waiting to present his rebuttal. "Thank you, Ms. Bondi," Roberts said, his voice quiet, almost subdued. "We'll hear from you now, Mr. Solicitor General." The spell was broken. A collective, silent exhale seemed to pass through the room. The Solicitor General, a seasoned and highly respected lawyer, rose to the lectern, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer arguing against Pam Bondi. He was arguing against the ghost of that crushing silence. He was trying to rebuild a fortress whose foundations had been publicly and systematically dismantled. Pam Bondi walked back to her seat, her face impassive. She gave David's arm a slight, reassuring squeeze. He looked at her, his eyes shining with a disbelief that was slowly hardening into pure admiration. They had done it. She had done it. She had not just presented an argument. She had controlled the entire intellectual terrain of the nation's highest court and, in doing so, had boxed its Chief Justice into a moment of profound, historic silence. The rest of the oral argument felt like a denouement. The Solicitor General made a valiant effort, but the questions from the justices now seemed colored by Bondi's framing. They pressed him on the limiting principle. They asked him to distinguish his case from Lopez. They were asking him the very questions that Bondi had predicted, the questions for which there were no truly satisfying answers. He was forced to argue that the digital world was simply different, an exception to all the old rules, an argument that sounded less like a legal principle and more like a plea for special treatment. When he sat down, the air of inevitability lingered. The rebuttal from Pam Bondi was brief, sharp, and confident. She didn't need to press her advantage. She simply had to remind the court of the clear, principled path she had offered them. "The federal government asks you to chart a new and boundless sea," she concluded. "We ask you to remain on the firm ground of the Constitution. Thank you." As the Chief Justice announced the case was submitted and the court recessed, a torrent of activity was unleashed. Reporters rushed from the press section, fingers already flying on their phones, on the marble plaza in front of the courthouse. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Legal analysts, who had been listening to the audio feed, were already surrounded by cameras, their faces alight with the excitement of witnessing a truly significant moment. "I have never, in 30 years of covering this court, witnessed a moment quite like that," said one well-known commentator to a live news camera. It wasn't just a sharp question or a clever answer. It was a systematic, logical dismantling of an entire legal theory. When Chief Justice Roberts went silent, it wasn't a lapse, it was an acknowledgement that Ms. Bondi had presented him with a logical box so perfectly constructed that any response would have been a concession. It was a masterclass in appellate advocacy. Inside the courthouse, away from the cameras, Pam and her team were walking down a quiet hallway. David was practically vibrating with energy. That silence, he kept repeating, that silence was everything. It was louder than any words. Pam smiled, the professional mask finally dropping to reveal a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. It wasn't about the silence, David. It was about the logic that produced it. We gave him no other choice. We respected the court by taking its own jurisprudence more seriously than even our opponents did. They entered a small conference room reserved for them. The rest of her legal team, who had been watching from the public gallery, burst into applause. The relief and elation were palpable. They knew they had not yet won the case. The decision would be months away, but they had won the day. In the most definitive way possible, within an hour. The story was no longer just a story for legal journals and cable news legal analysts. It was a phenomenon. Someone had isolated the audio of the exchange, Bondi's calm, relentless questioning, followed by the long, unbroken silence from the Chief Justice. They paired it with the official courtroom sketch of the scene. Bondi at the lectern, Roberts on the bench, his hand to his chin. The clip was posted online. It started on legal Twitter, where commentators hailed it as a textbook oral argument and a Socratic beatdown. Then it spread. The hashtag Roberts silent began to trend. People who had never read a Supreme Court opinion in their lives were watching this 30-second clip. They might not have understood the nuances of the Commerce Clause, but they understood the dynamic. They understood what it meant to see someone, through sheer force of intellect and preparation, leave the most powerful judge in the country with nothing to say. Memes began to appear. The courtroom sketch was photoshopped with Bondi saying, "Any questions?" and a blank speech bubble over Roberts's head. Social media influencers created short videos explaining the context in layman's terms. This lawyer just used the Supreme Court's own rules to tie the Chief Justice in knots. The virality was unprecedented for something so esoteric. It transcended politics. People weren't just cheering for a conservative or a liberal outcome. They were captivated by the raw display of intellectual dominance. It was a David and Goliath story, but with law books instead of slingshots. Back in his chambers, Chief Justice Roberts had removed his robe. He stood once again before the portrait of John Marshall, but this time, he felt a different connection. He felt the weight of a public perception that was now spiraling beyond his control. His clerks were studiously quiet, sensing his mood. He had not been embarrassed by a lack of knowledge. He had been, in his view, prudent. He had refused to walk into a trap that would have forced him to publicly wrestle with doctrines that could have massive, unforeseen consequences. Speaking would have been reckless. But the world outside didn't see prudence. They saw a silent defeat. Sarah Eisenberg finally broke the silence. "Sir, the media coverage is extensive." Roberts gave a slight, wry smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I imagine it is, Sarah. It seems in the modern world, a moment of careful consideration is easily mistaken for a moment of capitulation." He was an institutionalist, and he knew this moment, regardless of the final opinion in the case, had subtly altered the institution. It had brought the high-stakes, intellectual chess match of the court into public view in a way that was raw and unfiltered. And he wasn't sure that was a good thing. It personalized the process, focusing on a win and a loss rather than the collaborative, deliberative journey toward a sound legal judgment. In the days that followed, the legal community engaged in a deep and sustained analysis of what was now being called the Bondi box. Law schools began dissecting the transcript of the oral argument. In their constitutional law classes, professors used it as a prime example of how to frame an argument not around the desired outcome, but around the intellectual journey the court must take to get there. They taught students how she had built her case brick by brick, using the court's own precedents as the mortar until the structure was unassailable. The narrative solidified. This was a textbook moment, a demonstration of advocacy at its highest level. It was compared to famous cross-examinations in landmark trials, moments where a single, perfectly timed question changed the entire complexion of a case. For Pam Bondi, the experience was surreal. She was inundated with requests for interviews, all of which she politely declined. She knew the case was still pending, and any public comment would be inappropriate. She and her team returned to Florida, not to a victory parade, but to the quiet, diligent work of governance. But something had changed. She was no longer just a former attorney general or a political figure. She had become, in the public imagination, a legal titan, the woman who had used pure logic to silence the Chief Justice. Her public persona was now inextricably linked to that moment of intense intellectual pressure, her structured attack, her relentless but respectful questioning, and her ultimate success in dominating the debate had become a part of legal and popular lore. Months passed. The viral storm subsided into a steady current of discussion and analysis. The Supreme Court term was nearing its end, and the legal world was holding its breath for the decision in Florida v. United States. The speculation was rampant. Would the final opinion reflect the dynamics of the oral argument? Would the Chief Justice author it himself to reclaim the narrative? Or would he assign it to another justice to signal a broader consensus? The day the decision was to be released, the plaza in front of the court was once again packed. The tension was even higher than before. David Chen stood in the crowd, having flown back to D.C. on his own dime, just to be there. He felt a profound connection to this place, to the history that had been made within its walls. At 10 a.m., the court's website updated. The opinion was out. A flurry of clicks echoed through the crowd as people refreshed the page on their phones. David's hands trembled as he opened the PDF. The opinion was written by the Chief Justice himself. David began to read, his heart pounding. The introduction was classic Roberts, careful, measured, and focused on the narrowness of the holding. But as he read further, he saw it. The Chief Justice was adopting, almost wholesale, the logical framework that Bondi had laid out. He wrote about the critical distinction between economic and non-economic activity. He cited Lopez and Morrison as the controlling precedents. He painstakingly explained how applying the aggregation principle from Wickard to non-economic personal choices would erase any meaningful limit on federal power, turning the Commerce Clause into a general police power. It was her argument, translated into the official language of the court. The holding was a 6-3 decision in favor of Florida. The federal law was struck down, but the victory was secondary to the reasoning. The Chief Justice, in his opinion, had meticulously walked through the very logical box Pam Bondi had constructed. He didn't mention the oral argument or his own silence. He didn't need to. The opinion itself was the ultimate acknowledgement of her argument's power. By authoring it himself, he wasn't just conceding the point, he was institutionalizing it. He was taking her logic and cementing it as the law of the land. He had found the only way out of the box she had built, to walk through the door she had held open for him and declare it the proper path. It was a move of profound judicial strategy. He had absorbed the force of her argument and, in doing so, had reasserted control, using his role as Chief Justice to have the final say. The silence had been a moment in time. The opinion was forever, across the country. In her office in Tallahassee, Pam Bondi read the opinion on her computer screen. A slow, deep satisfaction settled over her. It wasn't the triumphant feeling of a gladiator. It was the quiet, profound fulfillment of an architect seeing her blueprints brought to life in stone and steel. The viral clips, the media frenzy, the hashtags, they were all ephemeral. But this written opinion, this was permanent. It was a validation of the long nights, the hard work, and the unwavering belief in a core principle. The story of the case would always be remembered for the dramatic silence that went viral, the moment a relentless advocate appeared to corner the Chief Justice. But for the lawyers, for the justices, and for Pam Bondi herself, the true story was in the quiet, unassailable logic that had compelled that silence. A logic that was now woven into the very fabric of American constitutional law. The courtroom drama had been spectacular, but the intellectual victory was sublime and ultimately far more enduring. The silence had been the thunder, but the opinion was the rain that would nourish the ground. For generations to come, the debate had been dominated not by volume, but by structure, not by aggression, but by an unyielding, relentless, and perfectly assembled argument that had left no escape, proving that in the highest court in the land, the most powerful force is not a raised voice, but a flawless line of reasoning. The legal community would indeed call it a textbook moment, not just for the silence that captivated the world, but for the quiet, irrefutable logic that had commanded it.